Maternity certainty is a modern luxury. Today, a simple cheek swab can answer the question with near total accuracy. But for nearly all of human history, there was no test, no science, no way to biologically confirm who a child's father was. So what happened when a woman genuinely didn't know, or when a community had doubts? The answer isn't just about biology. It's about law, marriage, land, inheritance, and survival. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to look at how ancient societies across the world handled one of the oldest uncertainties in human life, and the surprisingly creative, and sometimes harsh, solutions they built around it. 2. Before modern science, paternity wasn't just occasionally unclear, it was frequently unclear. There was no understanding of ovulation timing, no genetic testing. And in many societies, multiple partners across a woman's life were common, whether through remarriage, widowhood, or social custom. Motherhood was obvious, visible, undeniable, but fatherhood was, biologically speaking, an assumption. This single asymmetry shaped enormous parts of ancient life. Inheritance law, marriage customs, religious rules, and social status all had to be built around a fact nobody could actually prove. Ancient societies didn't ignore this problem. They built entire systems specifically designed to manage it. 3. One of marriage's oldest social functions across nearly every ancient culture wasn't romance, it was paternity assignment. If a woman was married, any child she had was legally and socially considered her husband's child, regardless of biological reality. This is sometimes called a legal presumption of paternity, and it shows up independently in cultures with no contact with one another, from Mesopotamia to ancient China. It solved a problem law couldn't otherwise solve. Instead of trying to prove biological fatherhood, societies simply assigned it through marriage. It wasn't about certainty, it was about creating a stable, workable answer everyone agreed to follow. 4. Ancient Rome captured this idea in a famous legal phrase, pater est quem nuptiae demonstrans. The father is he whom the marriage indicates. In Roman law, if a married woman had a child, her husband was automatically the legal father, full stop, with very limited ability to challenge it. This principle was so influential that versions of it survived in legal systems for nearly 2,000 years afterward, including in parts of European and even modern law well into the 20th century. Rome wasn't trying to determine biological truth, it was building a functioning society where inheritance, citizenship, and family lines could be assigned without endless disputes. 5. When legal presumption wasn't enough, ancient communities often turned to something far less scientific: physical resemblance. A newborn's nose, ears, or temperament might be scrutinized by relatives looking for reassurance or ammunition. Ancient Greek and Roman writers actually joked about this practice, noting how convenient it was that babies were declared to look just like their father, almost universally. This wasn't formal law, but it carried real social weight. A child who visibly resembled the mother's husband strengthened the marriage's stability and reduced gossip. It's a very human solution to an unsolvable problem. If you can't prove something, sometimes you just look hard enough until you believe it. 6. Ancient Egypt was notably more flexible than many neighboring civilizations. Women held significant legal rights. They could own property, divorce relatively freely, and remarry without severe social punishment. Because of this, children born into blended or reshaped households weren't treated as automatically shameful. Household and family identity in Egypt were often organized around the mother's home and lineage in practical terms, even in a broadly patriarchal society. If paternity was uncertain, a child was still typically absorbed into the mother's household and supported rather than cast out. Egyptian records show remarkably little of the harsh paternity-based stigma that shows up in some other ancient legal systems. 7. In ancient Greece, particularly Athens, paternity uncertainty was tied directly to anxiety over inheritance and citizenship. Only children of citizen fathers, and later citizen mothers as well, could inherit property or hold civic rights. This created intense social pressure around women's fidelity, not necessarily from personal jealousy, but from a very practical fear of misallocated inheritance. Greek households often kept women in more restricted domestic roles, specifically to reduce this uncertainty. It's an important reminder. much of the historical control placed on women's movement and independence wasn't random. It was frequently, explicitly about managing this exact unsolvable problem of paternal certainty. 8. In parts of the ancient Near East, including societies reflected in early biblical law, a custom called Levirate Marriage addressed a related problem. What happens when a husband dies before having children? A widow might marry her late husband's brother, and any child from that union was legally considered the deceased husband's heir, even though the biological father was someone else entirely. This wasn't seen as deception. It was an openly acknowledged legal fiction designed to preserve a family line, protect the widow's economic security, and keep property within the family. Paternity, once again, was treated as a social and legal category, not strictly a biological one. 9. Some ancient and traditional societies avoided the paternity question altogether through a completely different family structure. Polyandry, where one woman was married to multiple husbands, often brothers. This practice existed historically in parts of Tibet, the Himalayas, and among certain communities in southern India, such as the Naya people. In these systems, all husbands were considered collectively responsible for any children born, regardless of biological origin. Rather than trying to determine which husband fathered which child, the household simply shared paternal responsibility entirely. It's a striking example of a culture solving an unsolvable biological question by redefining fatherhood as a social role, rather than a genetic one. 10. In several ancient patriarchal societies, paternity uncertainty led to practices of female seclusion, limiting women's movement, contact, and independence, specifically to increase confidence in a child's paternity. This appears in various forms across parts of the ancient Mediterranean, Persia, and later medieval societies. It's important to understand this history honestly. These practices weren't about protecting women for their own sake. They were frequently rooted in male anxiety over inheritance and lineage, using a woman's restricted freedom as an indirect, imperfect substitute for the biological proof that simply didn't exist yet. Understanding this history helps explain the origins of customs that persisted for centuries afterward. 11. Without scientific proof, many ancient legal systems fell back on something almost as old as law itself, the sworn oath. A woman might publicly swear, sometimes before religious witnesses or at a shrine, that her husband was indeed her child's father. In several ancient legal codes, including some Mesopotamian and early Germanic tribal laws, an uncontested sworn oath carried significant legal weight, sometimes enough to settle inheritance disputes outright. This reflects something important about ancient legal thinking. In the total absence of physical proof, a community's trust in someone's spoken word, backed by religious or social consequence for lying, was treated as the next most reliable form of truth available. 12. In more extreme cases, some ancient and early medieval societies turned to trial by ordeal to settle contested paternity or fidelity disputes, physical tests believed to reveal divine judgment. These practices, documented in various early legal codes across Europe and parts of the ancient Near East, ranged from oath-based rituals to more severe physical trials. Modern historians view these practices with real skepticism and concern, since they were often applied unevenly and could be deeply harmful, particularly to women. They're worth mentioning, honestly, not as an endorsement, but because they reveal just how much social and legal pressure existed around an issue that biologically had no accessible answer at the time. 13. In many ancient and traditional societies, especially across parts of Africa, Oceania, and Indigenous America, biological paternity mattered far less than social paternity. A child's father might be understood as whichever man was married to the mother, or even a broader collective of male relatives who shared responsibility for raising, protecting, and providing for the child. This concept, sometimes summarized as "it takes a village," wasn't just a saying. In many kinship systems, uncles held father-like responsibilities specifically because biological fatherhood was considered less important than the social role of raising and providing for a child within the community. 14. It's important to acknowledge the darker outcomes of paternity uncertainty too. In some ancient societies, including parts of ancient Greece and Rome, a child whose paternity was seriously doubted or who was born outside an accepted union could be abandoned, a practice historians call child exposure. This wasn't universal or constant, and it existed alongside